Gods are real. Angels and demons are real. Divine forces and influences, they're all real, but not in the way you think. I know, me coming out and saying that, it probably raises questions, mostly about me and my sanity. And yeah, you're not wrong to question anyone who makes statements like that. But in this case, I ask that you set those questions aside, because what I have to say, it has real ramifications for every living soul on this planet, even the non-living ones. And no, that's not hyperbole. Believe me, I wish it were. To understand where I'm coming from and why I'm sharing this, I'll need to provide some background on who I am and how I came to this dark, disturbing knowledge. If I had time, I'd lay out every detail that led me to this point. And that way, everyone who hears my story will know the truth, grim as it may be. But unfortunately, I don't have that kind of time. So I'll try to focus on what's most important. Because God's being real and all, it has some pretty big implications, and not just for the world's major religions. And without wading too much into that minefield, I'll share some of my credentials. I was not born into a religious household. In fact, I was an atheist for most of my life, but not because of any choice or conviction. Religious God's theology, it just never affected me that much. Then, in college, I started studying mythology, and I became fascinated by it. It started with classic Greco-Roman mythology. Then I moved on to Indian and Mesopotamian mythology. From there, I studied Norse, African, and Native American mythology. Basically, if any culture had myths and folklore, I studied it. That was my passion. That's what interested me. It ended up leading me to a pretty successful career in academia. It helped me land a job as a tenured professor at a major university. It even helped me meet my wife. But that's another story altogether. Although it does become a factor later on. And had I just stuck with that line of work, I probably wouldn't be doing this right now. Hell, I'd probably be happier and healthier on every possible level, even if it revolved entirely around ignorant bliss. But sadly, an infinite amount of ignorance can't single out a single harsh truth. That's something my old philosophy professor once told me. I doubt she knew just how right she was. And while the first 10 years of my academic career were uneventful, that all changed when I met this eccentric grad student from the anthropology department. I'd rather not share his name, probably because it's been disavowed in so many circles. And I'll just say that he had some unconventional theories when it came to mankind's history. It started with a simple observation. Human beings as a species have existed on this planet for a long time, much longer than recorded history. Depending on which biologist you ask, anatomically modern humans have existed for between 200,000 and 300,000 years. But it wasn't until around 10 to 12,000 years ago that they settled and developed agriculture. And more complex civilizations didn't develop real records until around 6,000 years ago. That leaves a big gap in our collective history. Most anyone who studies anthropology in any capacity understands that. As a result, experts and non-experts alike have tried filling that gap with speculation. Most believe that for much of that history, humans simply lived as hunter-gatherers. Others have more ambitious theories, believing that there were many advanced civilizations that rose and fell during that time. But all traces of those civilizations have been wiped out by disasters, wars, and whatnot. Now that makes for great lectures and book sales, but the lack of hard evidence makes this a fringe belief at best. Now, let me just come out and say that neither conclusion is correct, but at the same time, neither is entirely wrong either. How I came to learn this? Well, it all came back to that eccentric grad student I mentioned. Now, I didn't buy much into his radical theories about human history, but he did intrigue me by appealing to my love of mythology. One point he made in particular really stood out to me. Just look at all the myths and folklore you study. Just imagine all the other myths and stories before recorded history. What sort of tales about gods, goddesses, and demigods did they tell? Whether he intended it or not, That question really got me thinking. It got me thinking so much that I actually lost sleep over it. Regardless of what civilizations may or may not have existed in prehistory, human beings love to tell stories. They love to craft myths. That's one of the few constants for our entire species, transcending language, race, era, and culture. The idea of so many stories being lost to time like that, it genuinely bothered me. So, when the grad student asked for my help on a little venture, as he called it, I jumped at the chance. He claimed he'd been studying some recently discovered cave complexes in North Africa. These caves were among the most well-preserved structures in the world, having been relatively unaffected by 200,000 years of geological upheaval. There was already evidence that these caves had been inhabited by humans at some point between 80,000 and 100,000 years ago. But the overarching consensus was that they were just hunter-gatherers. However, the grad student didn't buy that conclusion. He'd been studying all the cave art and artifacts that had been found in that complex. He suspected that the art told a story, a very important story about our prehistoric ancestors, as well as the gods that they worshipped. Based on what he showed me through pictures, I was inclined to agree. I pored over every one of the images he gave me for weeks. They all seemed to tell a story about an entire pantheon of gods or godlike beings. It had a lot in common with many other myths: immortal gods ruling over humans, humans worshipping these gods and making offerings to them. But those were just the basics. Without any written language or manuscripts, it was hard to discern the details. But the grad student believed there was much more to uncover, both for the story and for the site. So he asked me to sponsor him on a trip to conduct a more thorough excavation, despite the local government not being too keen on the idea. But since my voice carried more weight than his, I managed to get us the resources we needed. I even volunteered to go with him. Now, my colleagues advised against that decision. My wife also advised against it too. And in hindsight, I really wish I'd listened. Because what we ended up finding, there just aren't any words in any language or culture to do it justice. Just getting to that place was hard enough. And again, the local authorities did not like us digging more than we already had. They wanted to kick us out before we even arrived. Now, the grad student said he could change their minds and get us what we needed. And I kind of wished I'd asked for more details. I now suspect that he used less than ethical means to secure the permits and equipment. But I was gladly willing to overlook that at the time. And so long as he didn't tell me, that meant I didn't have to lie if I was ever asked. Eventually, we made it to the site. And after we got there, we spent a good 2 weeks digging deeper and studying the complex. And I will say this, it was quite an experience. I would describe it as nothing short of spiritual, being in a place where ancient humans once stood millennia ago, long before recorded history. I was so taken aback by the grandeur of this place that I often lost track of time. Some of the local contractors literally had to pull me away from the cave art, claiming we could not be there at night. But that sense of awe and wonder, it was oddly lacking in the grad student. He spent much more time helping with the dig, as though he knew there was more to the complex. And when a few geological surveys indicated there were chambers underneath the site, he didn't get excited, he actually looked fearful, as though he was dreading the truth. Finally, on the second to last day we were there, we made a discovery. We managed to open a hole into the chamber below. Me being so excited, and maybe a little reckless, I insisted on going with the grad student. At first, he protested. I suspect he wanted to protect me from what he might uncover. But even if he physically stood in my way, I was not going to be dissuaded. I had to know the full story of this place. So, with the aid of a winch, some industrial lights, and safety rope, 2 of us descended into the chamber. And you could immediately tell from the scent in the air that no human being had set foot in this place in over 80,000 years. I can't begin to describe the rush that comes with such discovery, or the horror that came soon after once we discovered what was in this chamber. I'll spare you the immediate reaction. There was quite a bit of yelling, cheering, and even a little profanity on my part. But what we saw down there I don't think there's an appropriate reaction for anyone, because it essentially destroyed the line between the world I knew and the myths and legends that I'd studied all my life. That chamber, as it turned out, was no mere chamber. It was a tomb, a very large tomb, one I doubt was meant to ever be reopened. But it wasn't like the elaborately decorated tombs of ancient kings or rulers. This was a lot more basic in terms of design and function. And as for the contents, well, there was nothing basic about that. In the center of it all was this figure. It was wrapped in layers upon layers of exotic fabrics that couldn't have possibly existed 80,000 years ago. It was also big, much too big to be an ordinary human. By my estimation, it was at least 20 feet long, and that's a low estimate, but it was still very human-like in terms of form. I know, that sounds impossible. Humans can't grow to be that tall. They also can't have skin that looks like polished silver, hair that looks like polished silk, or a face that seemed to be the physical manifestation of perfect beauty. Nothing about this was possible. But there it was, right in front of me. I didn't believe my eyes at first. Then I touched it, I felt it, I breathed in the air around it. And that convinced me that this was real. This being, whatever it was very, very real. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, but that didn't matter. I was here standing right next to it. And while I was brimming with excitement, my colleague, he had a very different reaction. He seemed less shocked by the sheer impossibility of what we were seeing and more concerned with the implications. He began shining our light on the walls around the tomb, and in doing so, it revealed similar drawings to the ones above, and they helped tell the rest of the story that I had longed to learn. But, as it turns out, that story was no mere myth or legend. It was an epilogue of sorts, the final act of a horrendous atrocity. It doesn't have a name, so I ended up calling it the death of God's mercy. In terms of mythological stories, it might very well be the darkest ever told. And that would be bad enough were it merely a myth. I don't have the time to tell the entire epic tale of how it unfolded. The pictures along the wall depict quite a saga. But at its core, it explains why every god, goddess, and demigod we've ever worshipped has been so ungodly, for lack of a better word. It lays out that early humanity emerged alongside this first pantheon of gods. And there was harmony between them. These beings, however many there were, they helped us, they loved us, and we in turn worshipped and loved them. It depicts a world that, for much of human history, was nothing short of a paradise. There was no war, hunger, hate, or suffering. Humans lived in relative peace, and gods and goddesses existed in peace alongside them. And together, they created so many wonders, cities, temples, and monuments that dwarfed anything our descendants would ever build. We even had technology that might as well have been magic, ensuring that everyone in this world was free of want and suffering. But at the core of this peace, the one component that ensured it worked for gods and humans alike was mercy. That was the God that mediated everything between mortal and divine. It was mercy that tempered inclinations of selfishness and injustice. Mercy that inspired kindness, compassion, and understanding. The mere notion of cruelty, the very concept of being petty, wrathful, and vengeful. I won't say it was unthinkable, but it was certainly minimized. But for this one God, the great disruptor as I called it just wasn't enough. This God wanted to do more, but it couldn't. Not as long as mercy was there. Once this deviant being made its intentions known, the other gods fought to exile it. Even humans joined in the effort, rising up and fighting to defeat this renegade god. But it didn't work. They all failed. They failed because they just didn't think a god could be so capricious and cruel to just I'm sorry. This is where the story hits extra hard. Because in the end, the great disruptor killed mercy. It killed the God that had brought so much prosperity and joy to so many. Because if the disruptor couldn't get what it wanted from humans or gods alike, then both would ultimately suffer. And suffer they did. Because with the death of mercy, suddenly the floodgates opened. Gods were suddenly unrestrained, unbound by the love, compassion, and harmony that guided them for millennia. As a result, many wars and conflicts followed, the kind that put every other classical myth to shame. Think the Genesis flood. Think the war between the Greek gods and the Titans. Think the final battle in the Book of Revelations. It was all that, magnified tenfold. Suddenly, all those myths and stories about gods drowning the planet, lusting after mortal women, boys, and animals, inflicting unspeakable torment on the living and the dead, it all made sense now. It all fit into this larger narrative, because without mercy, all gods have is power, and with power comes corruption, and with corruption comes cruelty. Horrible, unending cruelty. The story on its own is disturbing enough, but seeing it unfold in the tomb of an actual god, that made it more than just a story. That made it real. I would have had a full-on existential crisis on the spot had the grad student not done what he did. I still don't know how much or how little he knew about this dead god. All I know is when he saw that dead figure, he just lost it. He was already eccentric before, but now his sanity was all but gone. He just broke down and started beating on the chest of this corpse. I'll never forget his pained cries. "Wake up! Wake up! Please save us! Save us from the gods!" It definitely hit me personally, because there's a recurring theme in mythology. Pray to any god hard enough and they'll respond, but whoever did the praying tends to regret it. Well, this time it was manifesting in real life right in front of me. I watched before my eyes as this once articulate grad student descended into sheer madness. I'm not entirely sure what happened next. Maybe it was a result of mental instability, or maybe some capricious god did answer his prayer. Because when I went to console him, he turned around and he attacked me. In his eyes, I just didn't see a man anymore. I saw someone completely broken, mentally and spiritually. And in the darkness of this tomb, I saw his eyes flash. I heard his voice turn, and he started saying something that felt like the final lines of this horrible story.
No mercy, no justice. No mercy, no salvation. No mercy, no peace.
I prefer not to say how the fight played out. My strength is waning. I'll just say the struggle was arduous. I left that tomb with 2 cracked ribs, a broken jaw, 2 fewer teeth, and bloodied knuckles. And the grad student didn't leave. And shortly after we left, the cave collapsed. Possibly from shoddy drilling, possibly from intentional sabotage, or hell, possibly from mischievous gods covering their tracks. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that when I left that place, I didn't dare look back, and I didn't dare report what I found. At least at first. Now officially, the grad student died in a tragic accident, and I didn't find much else other than more ambiguous cave paintings. But unofficially, I just uncovered the secret behind every myth and every major religion in human history. I uncovered the truth about why our species has been around for so long but left so few traces. And, most disturbingly, I uncovered why gods, real, actual gods, are without mercy or compassion. They don't answer our prayers. They don't help us in our time of need. They can do to us whatever they want, be it good, evil, or indifferent. Because without mercy, there are no checks on their power. And we, ironically enough, are completely at their mercy. It is a grim, terrifying outlook, but one that fits the cold, hard facts. And having learned this horrifying truth, I just couldn't go back to my old life. I ended up losing my job at the university, and my wife left me when I suddenly decided I didn't want children. Of course, I couldn't tell her why, because honestly, who would want to have children in a world with merciless gods looming over us? After that, I lost my house, most of my money, and what was left of my mental health. I almost became a total recluse, but then a week ago, I found out I have a terminal illness. And as I write this, I have, I don't know, maybe a couple months left. I'm getting weaker by the day. I can't remain coherent for much longer. But regardless of what that priest at the hospital told me, I know there's nothing good waiting for me on the other side. Because any God that knows no mercy, be it the God of Abraham, the Olympians, the Indians, or the Scientologist, that's not a God you want to spend eternity with.